Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the fourth session of the Digital Classicist London seminar series. As you may know from previous sessions this year and from the program, we are looking at digital classics more globally, so not just the Mediterranean, but we are having people from different classical and ancient historical disciplines and different countries, and we are having several continents represented. And so on this note, I'm very happy and delighted to welcome Tariq Yousef from the University of Leipzig and Chiara Palladino from Furman University. And today's presentation topic or title is We Want to Learn All Languages, Applications of Translation Alignment in Digital Environments. And so they will introduce themselves and start the session very shortly, but I just wanted to give a quick note to everybody who is watching live, just to let you know that we have the chat live feature where you can leave your comments. It normally appears after this below the screen or on the right, depending on the browser. So please leave your comments, make any questions, or just say hi and let us know from where you are writing, because we love to read those. And if you are making any questions, we will make sure to bring those up during the discussion after the presentation. And if you are not watching live, just to remind everyone that this session will be available on YouTube for as long as YouTube exists under a Creative Commons license, so you can enjoy it after. And I think that's all. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Tariq and Chiara.
Hi, my name is Tariq Yousef, a computer scientist. I'm working at the University of Leipzig. I'm also a PhD student. I'm working mainly on the text alignment and visualization for text alignment. Chiara.
Hey everybody, my name is Chiara Palladino. I am Assistant Professor of Classics at Furman University, and I mostly work on annotation and visualization of ancient and pre-modern texts.
Yeah, so let's start with our presentation. Today we are going to present our recent work on translation alignment. So before we start, let's introduce what text alignment is. In general, text alignment is a comparison between two texts to find positions of similarities and differences between them. If the texts are in the same language, then we call the process intra-language alignment, which has multiple applications such as text-to-use detection, correlation, plagiarism detection. Or if the texts are in different languages, then we call it cross-language alignment or translation alignment. The alignment can be done between two texts, and then we call it pairwise alignment, or between multiple texts, so we call it multiple alignment. Also, text alignment has different levels. It can be at paragraph level, at sentence level, or at word and phrase level. So as you can see here in the pictures, it is pairwise inter-language alignment, and here we have pairwise translation alignment, and here three languages alignment. Parallel text, what parallel text is? Parallel text is text placed alongside its translation. And when we have like a group of text, we call it a parallel corpora. I mean, parallel corpora is very important for translation alignment and for automatic translation alignment and machine translation, because they can help us to find connection between vocabulary in the different languages. Here we can show some examples of parallel corpora. The Bible corpus contain here more than 1,000 unique translation. This is the most famous parallel corpora, a historical text, so we can find so many languages and multiple translation in the same language. We have also, for example, film subtitles. We can have the European Parliament the United Nations proceedings. So there are so many parallel corpora which we can use for a translation alignment. So the challenges of translation alignment. Translation alignment is not that easy as we think. From our experience on working on translation alignment, we face so many problems. I mean, the main problem is crossing dependency. If we have like source text and translation, it's not always the same that we have the same word order. Sometimes we have crossing on, not always like each token or each word in the source text has like correspondence in the translation. Also, the number of words or the translation is not always one to one. Also, the translation quality plays very important role in the translation alignment. If the translation quality is not that good, then the process of the alignment would be very hard. Also, the style of the translation. If we have like literal translation, it would be easier. Also, the cultural and linguistic context can also affect the results of translation alignment. Also, the problems of wordplays, allusion, and paraphrasing. Here we can show like very specific example of poetry. We have like the source text in Persian from Rubaiyat al-Khayyam, and we compare it with A3 translation. The literal translation here, which is like the literal word-to-word translation, and the meaning of the text, and the translation done by the translator Fitzgerald. If we compare, like here we have Anqasr Kah Jamshid, it's translated to Anqasr to the palace, the courts, the palace. Jamshid is translated to Jamshid. Jamshid here is translated to Arthur. Also, held his cup, so the grail, gloried and drank deep. So, I mean, drank, there is no mention at all to drinking in the source text, but as translator, he used his understanding to translate the text and add his understanding in the selection of the vocabularies. So here we have kind of lexical deviation. So when we start aligning or using automatic methods to align these texts, they will face very big problems because they will not find any correspondence between the drunk, deep, and the will not find any correspondence with the source text. Also, here if we look to the sentence order, here the first sentence is in the second line. Also, here we can see the translation is they say the lion. Here we have the doe and the fox. Here there is no mention to any animal. So we see the differences between the literal and the meaning and the actual translation by a human translator. So this is one of the most challenging problem when we work on, for example, on the automatic translation alignment, or if you work on the manual and you want to select correspondence between the translation and the source text. Now we are going to present the tool that we created 4 years ago. We started, it's called Ogaret, a tool for manual text alignment. We started at 2017. Our aim at the beginning was to create automatic alignment model. So if you want to create automatic alignment model, then you need training data. And the more accurate training data, the better the model is. So we thought, okay, let's create a tool to help us to create manual accurate training data. So we started with Ogaret. So the first aim was to generate accurate training data. Then people started using Ogaret for teaching, also for learning new languages, also for aligning text for like specific projects. And now Ogaret is used by 455 users. It includes 44 languages, more than 24,000 texts, and more than 500,000 of translation pairs. This is very interesting. Okay. So how can you work with Ogaret? It's very easy. You need to first to create an account on Ogaret, and then you upload your text. You select the language here. We have German and English, and then you click on Align, and then you will be redirected to this page where you can start selecting the correspondence between the source and the translation, either by clicking again or by clicking here and on the Save button. The translation pairs will be selected. Ogaret also is not restricted to only two languages. You can also work on three languages alignment. As here in this example, we have German, English, and Spanish. It's the same strategy. You start selecting the word in the first text, then in the second text, and then the third text, and then click on Save, or you just click on again on the first paragraph. So then you have to provide some metadata about the text you are aligning. Yeah, Ogaret also can be used as a reading environment where people can read the text in with their translations. We also provide a transliteration for some languages, especially for people who cannot read, for example, ancient Greek or Chinese or Coptic. So we provide kind of transliteration. It's not available for all languages, but we are working on that to make it as much as possible to any language in the database. So now we are moving to talk about applications of text alignment. So actually, after 4 years, as I mentioned, we have like a huge amount of translation pairs. So we thought how we can use or benefit from this database. The first application was to remodel the translation pairs in form of a graph database. So we thought, okay, let's take each translation pairs and we create like a node for each token, and we connect them with a relation called translation. This relation can save or can hold the frequency of how many times the word "got" is translated to this word. So after we modeled our database in this form, we got something similar to this image, but it's huger than that we can see here. It's very complex. The idea behind this modeling that we can exploit the structure of the graph to create correspondence between low resources languages or between languages that they don't have a direct translation. For example, if we have like Coptic and Armenian, so we don't have any direct translation between Coptic and Armenian, but we can, for example, use English as a bridge language. We can use the graph structure to traverse through the edges to create translation pairs, which can be used as training data for the automatic translation alignment models. So one application or one use of this graph database to create what we call translations cloud. So you can enter like a word, for example, the word city in English, and then you get the related translation. Most of these translations are not like direct translation or direct alignments, but by using the graph structure, we could reach, for example, the translation in Farsi, which is called DR, which is in the third level. So city is connected with polis, polis is connected with country, and country is connected with DR. So we have here like it's we reach city to DR through polis and country. As we can see here, having some relation like English Greek and Greek English, we can get kind of synonym. Maybe here it's not that very clear. We have city and country, but they are in the same topic or in the same direction. Here also we can see via this triangulation of this relation, we get, for example, government. It's somehow maybe correct. That depends on the text that people are aligning. It is poetry or normal text. For example, here we get mid the. So I guess this is created by mistake by some students, because until now we don't make any kind of filtering because since the tool is used by so many students, so we cannot guarantee that the alignments are correct. So one option is that we just take the transition pairs created by experts. So we already have like a list of experts who are using the tool. But the problem that the corpus they created is not that big enough to be helpful to create translation pairs for the low resources languages. Here is another example how we could reach the word kalki in Georgian via a Greek word. So on our database, we don't have any Georgian English text. We have Georgian Greek, and we have Greek English. But using this graph, data graph structure, we could create like translation pairs between English and Georgian. Okay, yeah. Second application of transition alignment is to create like automatic transition alignment. How we can use these data. There are two types of models that we can use. Statistical models. They are somehow old now. They are now in new models. I mean, the main and the most important models are the IBM models. They have created like 4 models. All the other applications they employ IBM models, but with some modification or improvement. Giza++ is the most famous software to create a translation alignment. The input of this software is parallel sentences. So, I mean, we need a huge parallel corpus to get like good alignments. We also have like the Berkeley aligner from 2009. The recent aligners, which is fast align, which uses also IBM models, create better results than Giza++ on historical languages. But also that depends on the size of the parallel corpora and the type of the text genre. Also, the efficient low memory aligner created in 2016, also it's kind of statistical model, also produce good results. Another kind of automatic translation alignment, it's the neural models, so then which use the neural networks. These models depend on word embeddings, which specifically multilingual embeddings. For example, when we train a model on multilingual text, the input also parallel text, then we can measure the distance between each two words. For example, here we measure the distance between the and the word eine in German. It's kind of a semantic distance, or it's like distance between two vectors in the n-dimensional space. And then we get all these distances in the form of two-dimensional array, and then we can extract like the optimal alignment from these. So this is the new and more accurate and more interesting models for these days. This aligner called Awesome Aligner. It's created in 2020. Yeah, last year. it uses per model. The nice thing here that we can train our own model on our own parallel data. So if we have like good amount, a large amount of text in two languages, we can train a language model, and then we can get a liner in very easy way. So this was my part. Now we can move to Chiara.
All right, thanks, Tariq. So I'm going to once again activate my screen sharing. I hope that everybody can see. All right, so I'm going to illustrate a couple of applications that we used this data for. At one point, we realized that we had a pretty big database with a lot of translation pairs and a lot of aligned texts, and we decided to run a few observations to try to understand a few things. And today with you, I'm going to share two cases that we analyzed. So in the Ugarit database, currently we have more than 500,000 translation pairs, and we realized that some of these could be used to make some observations that were both corpus-wide and at the level of behavioral patterns of certain users. And so, first of all, I want to introduce a couple of observations related to the corpus-wide analysis. In order to run a couple of those calculations, we selected a subset of aligned text by selecting especially trusted users because of the various inconsistencies that Tariq mentioned before. So we decided to select only subsets of what we had. And we tried to analyze them to observe language and context-dependent trends. So for example, measuring rates of alignment at one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, and many-to-many translation pairs. And we only considered subsets that reach the threshold of minimum 900 translation pairs, excluding punctuation. So actually our smallest subset for this presentation in particular is more than 1,000 translation pairs. So that turned out pretty well. And in general, corpus-wide, the most prominent research question that we had was whether different combinations of languages would show remarkably different patterns in the establishment of translation pairs, and why. And we work with two hypotheses, one based on structural linguistic factors and one based on cultural differences. And I'm going to expand on those in a second. And today we are presenting for the first time our preliminary observations on that. I want to stress preliminary because this is very much a work in progress, but I also want to stress first time. I swear that this is not a recycled slide from a previous presentation. This is actually the first time that we're sharing some of this analysis with people. So we very much welcome feedback and questions about that. Before I start, I want to point out a couple of limitations of these observations first. Number one, we do not have control on the languages or texts that our users choose to align, of course. And this means that our observations are always going to be limited by the corpus that we have. And it has a couple of consequences that I think it's important to point out. In most cases, we cannot observe whether there is a significant change in the alignment trends if, for example, we invert the language pairs. So, for example, we have one of our biggest subsets is a Farsi-English corpus, but we very much don't have a lot of alignments of the opposite, English text translated into Farsi. And we're also not particularly able to establish, for example, comparisons across similar linguistic types. So, for example, Semitic languages or more than a few Indo-European languages. And quite surprisingly, we also have very little comparative data for Romance languages. With the exception of Italian and partly German, we're missing a lot from French, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. And I'll come back to this issue at the end of the presentation. Number two, we don't have any information on the degree of overlap between words in different languages. In other words, the numbers that I'm going to share with you do not tell us anything about whether those tokens, those words align with each other in a complete way, in a perfect way, or whether there is only a possible or partial alignment, or whether there is a very incomplete rate of alignment. And ideally, this issue could be solved in the future by giving users the opportunity of adding specific tags to their alignments to discriminate between these typologies, and we're definitely working on that. And then number three, which is, I think is important, we did not have the ability of further substantiating our analysis with automatic morphosyntactic tagging or part of speech. And this depends on the fact that we mostly work with languages that have little resources, that are historical or underrepresented, for which these services are either not accurate enough or do not even exist. And so we occasionally did look at intersection data from the corpus, and we were able to manually detect some patterns by manually assigning part of speech information, but obviously that is not sustainable for big data and for a big corpus. So this is a limitation that we always need to consider. So for this first use case, I want to emphasize a couple of trends that we noticed corpus-wide by considering a few subsets of all the alignments that we had from trusted users. Not surprisingly, the biggest corpus of text that we have is a variety of languages aligned against English translations. And here you can see the four of the biggest data sets in that category: Farsi to English, Ancient Greek to English, Latin to English, and Coptic to English. And you can see here the length measured in number of tokens between the first language, the language of the source, and the translation, the rate between the two, and the percentages of one-to-one alignments, one-to-many, many-to-one, and many-to-many. Now, there are a couple of trends that are definitely quite visible, especially for the three languages of Indo-European descendancy, Farsi, Ancient Greek, and Latin. One-to-one translation pairs are definitely predominant across these typologies with an average of 60%. But there is also a big tendency towards one-to-many alignments. So one word in the source language, whether it is Farsi, Greek, or Latin, is often aligned against more than one word in English. And there are a few explanations for this. One, I think, is pretty natural. We can work on the assumption that a translation would more naturally try to map itself onto the source language rather than the opposite. And this may explain why rates of many-to-one and many-to-many are particularly low across the board, not just in these categories in particular. And on the other hand, there is always a necessary tendency to sometimes compensate on the side of the translation by leaning towards paraphrasing or explanation and so on. And this is confirmed by the fact that on average, the length of the second language is much higher than that of the first language. In the case of this subset, Farsi, Greek, and Latin, there are also linguistic factors that are definitely instrumental to this phenomenon. All the three languages here are either highly inflected or agglutinative languages for Farsi. That is, they construct meaning by adding morphemes to words rather than by multiplying the number of words that they use. And so for Greek and Latin, this phenomenon is typically exemplified by the inflection of verbs and nouns. For Farsi, there is a phenomenon of derivational agglutination, which doesn't always change the appearance of a word, of a morpheme, but essentially achieves the same result. That is, slightly inflected or more analytic languages like English have a much higher tendency to express the same meaning with more words compared to the other languages in this category. For Farsi, however, the one-to-many rate was definitely interesting because it is by far the highest for this category. It's almost 40%, which is definitely a big number. And it is in general also a much higher average across the board. And it is definitely confirmed by the fact that the length of the corpus in English is almost double the length of the corpus in Farsi. So this cannot exclusively be explained in terms of linguistic structural differences. We believe that there is also a cultural component at play here. And we consider that our Farsi corpus is composed almost exclusively of traditional poetic texts, like the Diwan Hafiz, for example. And although we have observed in other experiments that differences in text genre do not significantly affect alignment patterns, we do believe, however, that English translations of Farsi literature may have a higher tendency towards alteration and paraphrasing compared with other languages like Ancient Greek or Latin. So this may provide a partial explanation to that. The most peculiar, however, is Coptic to English, where the trend between one-to-one translation pairs and one-to-many is actually inverted. So there is a much higher tendency here to translate or to align English composed by many words against one word in Coptic. And this is very interesting, particularly because, on the other hand, the opposite, one-to-one, is definitely low compared to the average. And this can perhaps be explained by a peculiarity, so to speak, of Coptic. Coptic is characteristically uncertain in the establishment of word bounds because Coptic manuscripts do not have spaces. And so there is a big debate among scholars in terms of where we should establish boundaries between words. And the corpus that is used in Ugarit, in particular, uses the strategy that is prevalent today, the Layton bound group, which is identifying single words based not on morphology, but on prosody, so the presence of a stress, and some other tweaks based on punctuation and clitics. And so this set of rules in the establishment of words is definitely completely different than English, and it definitely conditions the pattern. It can also be noted that the length between Coptic and English in this case is also not particularly relevant, and so the phenomenon can only be explained through linguistic reasons. The other biggest corpus that we had, also probably not surprising, was translations from ancient Greek into different languages. And you can see the most prominent subsets of the corpus in here. Now, one thing that surprised us, although maybe it shouldn't have, but it definitely surprised me, is that ancient Greek and Latin map almost perfectly onto each other. Their one-to-one rate is by far the highest, not just in this subset, but in the entire corpus, no matter which numbers we consider. And the working hypothesis here is obviously that they are the most closely related languages in terms of family. And so we are working on this idea, although we should notice that the Latin intended here is definitely the scholarly Latin or the Neo-Latin of late scholarly translations. It's definitely not the classical Latin, the historical Latin that we're used to. We would like to further expand this idea by adding Sanskrit, the other big Indo-European language, to the corpus and see what happens. So we're definitely working on that as well. As a working hypothesis, we can imagine that the less affinity across languages can influence the variety across trends in the establishment of translation pairs and generally leads to less one-to-one translation pairs. But by far the most interest subset in this part of the corpus is the alignment of Greek to Georgian. The pattern here between one-to-many and many-to-one translation pairs is inverted. And this happens uniquely in Greek to Georgian across the corpus, not just here. Many-to-one has definitely a very high rate, 22%, compared to one-to-many where we only have 15%, which is definitely a low rate, all things considered. This is the highest and the many-to-one rate in the entire corpus. And this is interesting because we were working on the assumption that this would very rarely happen, specifically because a translation would have the tendency to, either express the same meanings with more words or mapping more exactly onto the words of the original. Here, there seems to be an opposite tendency. And this can probably be explained by the fact that the linguistic differences here are much more powerful. Georgian is a Kartvelian, strongly agglutinative, polysynthetic language with a rich noun inflection, one of the most complex verbal systems in the world, and it is definitely much more synthetic than Greek, which is still a synthetic language, but not as powerful. And this may perhaps lead to the hypothesis that one word in Georgian can express the meaning of several words in Greek. And bear in mind that we're talking about Georgian translations of ancient Greek texts. As you can see here, this is also the only part of the corpus where the length of language 1, ancient Greek, is actually more than the length of language 2, Georgian. So a few concluding observations for this case study. Translation alignment really across the corpus allows us to observe the complex interplay between culture, textual reality, and linguistic structures. And our corpus demonstrates that it really is impossible to translate a text word by word with a perfect correspondence. And not even in the most perfectly overlapping languages like ancient Greek and Latin, it is possible to achieve a 100% one-to-one alignment. It's still a 90%. But also we want to notice that the language systems of the source and of the target do interact and influence the process of achieving a translation alignment. And so when compared, the distinctive patterns of languages like Georgian, Coptic, Farsi reveal that there are structural linguistic differences playing a role in the establishment of correspondences between texts. So in other words, it's not just the choice of a translator. There are external factors at play here. But of course, not everything can be explained with purely linguistic arguments, and cultural attitudes to certain texts and certain traditions definitely play a part. The second experiment that we wanted to do was an examination of behavioral patterns in expert users that had very similar backgrounds to see if their alignments would actually correspond. So we selected two groups of virtually perfectly identical users, two native Farsi speakers, two native Italian speakers who aligned the same selection of texts against the same translation. And both of them operated without guidelines. I'm going to come back to this point in a second. What actually surprised us when we examined both of the groups was that despite the fact that their alignment strategy was pretty much similar, or there was nothing outrageously different between the two, when it came to comparing the actual translation pairs, so the actual tokens that they aligned, in group one, only 50% of the translation pairs actually overlapped with each other across the two users, which means that two virtually identical users made very different choices when it came to establishing correspondences of meaning across the tokens in 50% of the cases. And so we investigated the intersection data manually to try to understand what was going on. And part of the differences, a good part of the differences, could definitely be explained by the lack of guidelines. And we considered that the two users definitely had two different strategies when it came to addressing differences due to the different linguistic structures of Farsi versus English. So for example, you can see here that user 2 in the chart definitely had more tendency towards establishing one-to-many correspondences compared to user 1. And so compared to user 1. And so for example, you can see that one of the users, user 2, definitely incorporated prepositions in English, articles, and so on, based on the fact that Farsi incorporates those things into the same word structure. But this could probably be addressed by guidelines that take into consideration these, structural differences and guide the users towards a consistent alignment strategy. However, we observed that some words were much more problematic than that and couldn't be possibly predicted by guidelines. So for example, the word Hordan, and I apologize to any Persian speaker who may be watching for my pronunciation, was aligned by one of the users against eat and by the other one against to eat or drink. And it is interesting because this word in Persian has a much richer range of meanings than just to eat. It can mean to eat, but also to gnaw, to drink, or even to suffer. And so in this case, both of the users evidently made a personal choice. One of them probably privileged a simpler kind of translation, evidently privileging also the one-on-one tendency. And the other one maybe had a different understanding of the context and thought that this alignment required an expansion of the meaning by using the entirety of the translation in this case. So evidently there was a different understanding either of the word or of the context or of the text itself by one of the two users. And it largely happens the same with the second word that I'm exemplifying here, ba, which technically means with, but the translation was actually richer. And so one of the two users aligned it with endowed with. And again, we can see pretty much the same tendency between these two users. And again, in theory, this case could be solved with a very strict set of guidelines, but at the same time, it could be questionable to do so from the standpoint of the translation. In fact, the translation here is technically made up of two words, not one. And the first user may have considered this factor and may have a different understanding of the context, thinking that maybe the context required a more, a richer type of translation as opposed to the simple preposition with. Whereas the other user evidently had a more simple strategy in this case. This phenomenon was largely repeated with group 2, Latin to Italian. Although here the rate of the translation pairs that did not overlap was significantly lower, it was about a quarter. Once again, we see pretty much the same distinctions. Some differences in the translation pairs could definitely be compensated by the establishment of guidelines, because they essentially depended on how certain structures in Latin had been addressed by the two users. And so, for example, verbs that require, in their Italian translation, the addition of a particle, of an introductory conjunction, and so on, were aligned in different ways by the two users, and so on and so forth. But some differences were definitely editorial choices of the two users. So for example, here we see the accusative of the Latin orbis terrae, which one of the users aligned by choosing terrae and aligning it with il mondo, which is the globe, and orbem with intero, the whole. The other one aligned orbem with il mondo, with the globe, and didn't align terrae. Now, orbis terrae in Latin literally refers to the terrestrial globe, and globe, orbis, implies also some kind of idea of completeness and roundness at the same time. So in this case, the two users had definitely different choices in terms of the alignment, and there is really no choice that is more correct than the other, and it is very difficult to try to establish a case like this with the guidelines. The other one is also very interesting because it's pretty much like the ba word in Persian before, novis rebus. In Latin, res novae is a typical expression that indicates political innovations, revolutions. And user 1 aligned it against a rivolgimenti, so at towards revolutions, and the other one added the adjective, a rivolgimenti politici, so towards political revolutions. Now, the two expressions are virtually the same in Italian, and given the context, they could not possibly be mistaken for something else. But one of the users evidently understood that this alignment required that additional element that was provided by the translation. And again, probably it was also more faithful to the will of the translator himself, who had added that adjective in the alignment. In the translation. So a couple of concluding observations regarding this, and I think it's very important to consider these because when we started working with Ugarit, we wanted to do this in terms of a crowdsourcing project to create manual translation pairs that would be used as training data for translation alignment models. Now, the premise of that is that manually established translation pairs are necessarily more consistent and more accurate than the ones that are created by a machine. They may be more accurate, but they are not more consistent. And there is really no way to address all of this with guidelines. On the one hand, we definitely want to establish that guidelines need to consider the structural linguistic differences between the language of the original and the language of the translation in order to give users some kind of pathway through the two. But some things cannot possibly be addressed with guidelines and have to do with the context, with the user's understanding of it, and the user's understanding of the vocabulary, with the editorial choices and other contingent factors. For example, a user may not have that much time to do the alignment. And if they are more busy, they won't have much time and they will privilege maybe a more concise strategy. If they have never used a tool before, they may need, a kind of a learning process. And of course, their linguistic background, their education, their familiarity with the text that they are aligning, they all play a part into this phenomenon. And bear in mind that we consider two groups that were ideal for this experiment, which is definitely not the case for the majority of the crowdsourcing projects. And so in terms of future work, we really want to expand on this experiment by using another group of users that will be performing the same alignment with guidelines and without guidelines. And we're going to analyze how their behavior changes, and if and to what extent we can still register the same tendencies. And another experiment that we're running is an investigation into the different behavior of non-expert users, like students versus experts, so the instructors. And this is the reason why I want to conclude with this. We're looking for people who know languages because we really want it all. As I said, this analysis is really contingent on the nature of the corpus that we have, but there are so many things that are not in the corpus yet, or there is not enough. So if you know really any language from ancient Greek, but we want Chinese, we want Sanskrit, we want Persian, we want everything. If you know any language and you're interested in doing translation alignment, we are looking for you and we need you. So please get in touch, and we promise that we will be able to support your effort into establishing alignments, and we can also add features upon request to make sure that different alphabets and different transliterations are covered so that you can do the work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Chiara and Tariq. That was super interesting. I was fascinated not just by all the applications, but all the linguistic conclusions that you were mentioning. And at the beginning, where you were explaining what translation alignment is, I couldn't stop thinking about the Rosetta Stone as maybe one of the best examples of this alignment, no? And so before, I have a couple of questions, but before I say my questions, I don't know if anyone in the audience wants to start. Just also before we wait for people in the chat to have theirs. But I have a question about two questions, in fact. One thing is, what happens when the word that is required to be translated doesn't exist in one of the two languages? Have you seen any interesting behaviors in that sense? And the other is, I was super interested in what you said about how your culture and your cultural attitude and your tradition can have an impact in your translation. Have you seen any examples about this, or can you share any specific cases about this? So those are my two questions.
Tariq, you want to maybe reply to the first one?
Yeah, the problem of the translation and the source text is not always the translation is one-to-one. So many times you find like text in the source language has no correspondence in the meaning. In this case, we just leave it without alignment. So we have so many cases where not 100% of the text can be aligned, but maybe 80% or 85% of the text. This is no problem, because especially in some, for example, in poetic text, it's impossible to find always like correspondence between the source and the translation, because translators express their understanding of the text in maybe in different vocabulary, different selection of words. So this is normal, and we deal with this case. We just leave it without any correspondence.
Okay.
Yeah. And then in terms of the second question, I also see that Clifford Robinson has asked something slightly similar. We haven't run the experiment yet, so for both of the questions, so I don't have a definite answer to that. Currently, in terms of behavioral patterns, we are trying to see what happens at different levels of expertise. So if a user, the less expert a user is, the more certain patterns tend to manifest themselves. And so that's one thing that we are definitely considering right now. I also want to address Clifford's question right away, because it's kind of in the same field. Have you, if you've considered aligning tree texts, we haven't considered any trilingual alignments, just because the techniques for extracting the data from those are different than for bilingual alignments. So for this particular extension of the work, we only considered bilingual alignments. But definitely again, given the questions, there's a ton of things that we could do, and we'll definitely try.
But also we don't have enough data. I mean, for three language alignment, we don't have enough data to run an experiment. And here I want just to use the chance to thank Clifford on he have been using Ogaret with his students for in the last few months, and they created a great alignments and so many text alignment. Thank you for using Ugarit and providing this amount of translation errors.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Clifford, as well. And I wanted to share. So we have a question from Gabriel, from Gabi, that he put in the chat. Were there any interesting patterns in the percentage of unaligned words in either direction?
We haven't measured that. I'm not sure if we can, actually.
No, we can. Yeah, for sure we can. And actually, it was on our maybe a long-term to-do list, not now, because now we are interested in the aligned parts. But yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was interesting. Like in the Persian English, Farsi English alignment, there was so many missing parts. I mean, things in the source not existing in the translation, and also in the translation not existing in the source, and that was also remarkable, because I have been working on another project parallel to Ogaret, visualizing the one half, which is the English Farsi German parallel text, and so sometimes you find like half of that the English translation has no correspondence in the source text, but as I said, this is like special case because it's poetic text, and also like it was. I showed the text for a German professor who said, "Okay, these two texts are not parallel because this German translation has nothing to do with this English translation." And it was, we were sure that they were like exact translation for the Farsi. That means every translator understood the text in his own way and expressed that in the translation.
I also want to say that it is particularly difficult to come to conclusions or even observations regarding unaligned texts, because that investigation really requires looking into the context and trying to understand reasons why that happened, which is not necessarily just that the word wasn't there, you know. And this would be definitely helpful to have proto-speech and morphological data about those cases in particular, but we're working with what we have.
Okay, thanks so much. We have another question from DC commentaries. At what level do you think that Latin or Greek students can begin to do alignment effectively? Do students need a year or more to begin? 2 years?
I believe that's Chris Francese. Hey, okay. Define effectively. I believe personally that alignment is effective for learning since the very beginning, because the results, the output may not be accurate. Nobody expects them to be accurate, of course, but they are effective in the sense that they encourage the students to question the authority of the translations, and they also, I've also found that they encourage the students to problematize the relationship between the languages. So effectively starting to wonder why English uses preposition plus noun while Latin doesn't, for example, and trying to get to a more analytical understanding of how that results in a variation. For example, how many times English uses a completely different pair of words to translate the same word or the same case. So I would say I personally use alignment straight away. Maybe I don't use it that intensively at the beginner level, but definitely it can be scaffolded to become pretty intensive already at the intermediate.
And now Helma asks, I'm curious whether you have been able or would consider to ingest data from other sources, interlinear text, dictionaries, etc.
Dictionaries, it's good. Maybe considering dictionaries has other application than comparing the languages. Maybe for creating dynamic lexicon or exploiting the graph structure for finding correspondence between low resources languages. But I mean, in dictionaries, we cannot get kind of frequency of these pairs, like this phrase is translated to this phrase like 20 times or 100 times. So we always have maybe one-to-one. It's not like the when you align in context. So dictionary just give you maybe the lemma or the root of the word that doesn't give you the usage of this word in context. This is the main difference. But of course, we can use dictionaries for creating, as I said, dynamic lexicons or correspondence between low resources languages. Yeah.
And now Alexandra Churchill asks, hi to all. First of all, I would be interested in knowing how many words were not aligned. For instance, if one translator align a word with see that and the other see, what happens with that? I suppose, do you still account for those words that are lost in the translation, or?
Yeah, basically, it's not accounted for a token that is in the alignment. It's not lost in the sense that we keep a record of the percentage of the tokens that have been aligned versus those that haven't been aligned. But let's say that you should go back to the context to see if it was there or not.
One more from Alexandra. How many words are left out in the alignments? I guess it's too close to Gabi's question.
Yeah, as we said, it's like depends on the text genre, on the quality of the translation, on the type of the translation. So
yeah,
it's different. Until now, we don't have kind of official statistics about that, but yeah, we can provide this kind of numbers. Yeah,
we can definitely provide statistics on the sort of big corpus. Although I would say that as a user, I've seen that there is a very wild difference depending on the nature of the text and the nature of the translation. There is an average depending on the language pair, but it's not a certainty. It can vary very significantly.
Okay. And I had one more question. I was wondering, because you were mentioning the importance of the guidelines and how guidelines can really help in improving the alignment. Those guidelines are just referred to the linguistic structure of the language, or maybe could reflect also the cultural background of the language. I was thinking, for example, some languages have words for specific things, like I think Inuit languages have 1,000 words for snow or something like that, and others just we only have snow as it is. So would that be reflected in the guidelines or not at all?
I think it depends on what you want to use guidelines for.
Mm-hmm.
Because guidelines are typically used in the collection of training data. Mm-hmm. And so the purpose is to ensure maximum consistency across the translation pairs. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, and so there are different degrees of guidelines. They can be more or less strict. Mm-hmm. But the more strict they are on what you're calling the cultural side of things, the more you are at risk of losing elements in the actual relationship between the languages and meaningness, elements of meaning in the way in which a translation relates to the source. Because if you establish very strict guidelines in terms of how the English word snow should be aligned against Inuit, then you lose everything else. So it's really a question of what is the purpose for establishing the guidelines and trying to be very, very careful with that.
Yeah. Here we can say something that like in transition alignment, there are no gold standards because when we go on to want to evaluate like automatic transition alignment model, we need like gold standards, manual alignment. But the experiment showed us like even with the existence of guidelines, the transition alignment, the manual transition alignment is somehow subjective. We will get maybe 80% or 90% of agreement between two annotators, but will not get 100%. Therefore, the gold standards they don't exist for evaluating evaluating automatic models. And this is a big question because until now, I mean, on all the papers that presented automatic methods for automatic transition alignment, they just mentioned we used this data set to evaluate our system, and they just presented numbers about the accuracy of the system, but we don't know from where this data set or how this data set is created, how many annotators, how much was the agreement between them. So this experiment showed us gold standards don't exist for transition alignment.
Okay, and I think Gabi, you wanted to. Gabi and Valeria. Valeria.
Well, first of all, thank you. I think that this tool is amazing and it's a lot of fun to use. And I just wanted, briefly to comment on how interesting it is to, develop something for a purpose like you did with Ugarit and then see people, stretching its functionalities and do something else with it. And, personally, I have invited, friends that are working with comparative translations to use it, for example, to compare two different translations in a language of the same original. And they found it really, really interesting and useful. And my actual question is actually going back to something that you said, that you were aiming to use some languages as bridges to connect two languages that don't have a direct translation. And I was wondering how, effective that process has actually been, and how much, there has been, like, the Chinese whispers, like, things that, how much got lost in the, in this step, if you can comment a little bit on that.
I mean, maybe if we can go to the screenshot from the graph, it's very clear. I will share my screen. So maybe I don't know all the languages listed here, but at least you can see, like, when you start with the word city. I mean, here all the word connected words. If I go back one slide back, maybe to show you this graph, like every word here, these are translation pair created manually by Ogaret user. On this edge or this connection between two texts hold like the frequency of how many times these two words are aligned. And after creating all this graph database, we came to this. So if you start with the city, you could get to the, for example, to the article D in German, which is the in English, which is like wrong alignment, because maybe on some text contain like a connection between a city and the maybe by mistake or for some reason, but it's not always the case that we get great results from this. But just to say, until now, we don't use any filtering, we don't use any NLP methods, or we don't have any threshold of frequency to consider that of alignments. But look, you could get, for example, some errors. For example, city is by mirroring, you get like public, which is not that correct. State, citadel, country. I don't. Acropolis. Some of them are correct, but some of them may be combined with articles, with the propositions, with. So, I mean, this method is effective when we know that the alignments are correct, And also, the more the distance between two languages, I mean, the more errors you get. I mean, if you go, for example, for 5 levels or 5 like intermediate languages, of course, maybe like the Chinese whisper, I mean, the source information will be very different in the destination. But as you see here, via mirroring, if you go English to Greek and then you go back from Greek to English, we already get so just one level of alignment. So here, many factors affect the quality. For example, we could aggregate all the similar words like of city, the city, town, the town. So some pre-processing and post-processing steps could help, but there is no guarantee that we can get at the end good results.
Thank you.
And we are running out of time, but do we have time for another? Oh, Gabi, do you want to make your question? Or it's fine. So another more question from the chat, and another question. Did you try to make the same translator align the same text twice? If yes, were his/her choice consistent?
We didn't intentionally. I have aligned texts more than once personally for various reasons, but it actually depends on whether the translator is an expert user or not, because non-expert users will have much less consistency. In general, not even if they realign the same text across the text, they will have less consistency. But expert users, they generally are extremely consistent. Of course, it can happen that in the course of time, they will change their mind regarding the alignment of individual tokens. And again, that's part of what Tariq was saying about the fact that there is no gold standard. And so again, what's consistency after all? One may have a different understanding of a text and the translation and decide that they want to align it differently this time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and one more from Helma. Well, I'm not sure about reading ancient Greek, but that's police. No, sometimes requires a translation with a finished article in English. I wouldn't consider the. No, it was a comment of what we were saying about police and the bags. And Nick, I'm curious why city is produced in multiple forms.
Of rhetor.
Yeah.
So I think, these are all observations. I can probably very, very quickly address a couple of these. So in the graph data, in the big database that we have, we are not discriminating between non-experts and expert users. And so obviously the data is somehow noisy because it includes a lot of data from non-experts and mostly students. And so a lot of the inconsistencies that you see there are probably due to the fact that there is a ton of data that in a more accurate corpus-wide analysis would be taken out.
Okay, great. So
also, the inconsistency you see between, not in terms of making actual mistakes, but in terms of whether you decide to include articles and prepositions as part of the word you're aligning or whether you don't, can be to do with what alignment strategy you've taken on that day. And even an expert user might have a different strategy with two different texts for being aligned for different reasons.
Yeah, for sure.
Very different statistics in those cases.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Chiara and Tariq. I am not a text expert by any means or anything, but I found it super interesting, and I had so many questions, so it was fabulous. Yeah, a big applause.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone who saw it online. Just to remind everybody, we will be coming back on the 9th of July with Hayley Jounian from Helsinki, speaking about matching readable text for Egyptologists. So we hope to see you there, and thank you very much, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.